I now introduce you to Steve Lapidge.
Thank you for the opportunity to present today. As John has mentioned, my name is Steve Lapidge. I'm a born and bred Adelaide person, and so it's nice to be back and running this research centre here. Of course, you are going to all finish your lunch, aren't you? Because no one leaves until all the food's gone. You're going to hear that joke a few times. So, I'd like to start by really painting the scene of global food waste. So today's menu is what's happening around the world in terms of food waste, why we're actually interested in reducing food waste in Australia, and then the organisation that we've recently created. Can I get a quick show of hands? Who's heard of the Cooperative Research Centre program, CRC program? About a third to a half. So the CRC program's been going for 25 years now in Australia. It was actually created by Bob Hawke and the chief scientist at the time, Ralph Slatcher, and it's the main vehicle by which we try and get industry working with our leading academics and researchers in this country. So if you've ever flown in a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, those wingtips came out of a CRC. If you've used disposable contact lenses, that came out of a CRC. There's a whole range of successful products that have come out of CRCs. So, throughout this talk, I'll talk about both food loss and food waste, and it's important to recognise the difference from the outset. So food loss is food that's grown for human consumption and is lost before it gets to the retailer or the consumer. Food waste is what happens thereafter. So if a supermarket throws it out or if you throw it out at home, then that's wasted food. It's not lost throughout the supply chain. So the global picture. We're wasting $1.65 trillion worth of food around the world each year. Now, for the economists in the room, you might be thinking, well, that's about the same as Australia's GDP. So we take the wealth of Australia and we throw it out, and that's just a ridiculous scenario. So in the developed world, 1 billion people waste 56% of the food. So again, come back to the definitions. Waste, it's at the end of the supply chain. In the developing world, 6 billion people lose 44%. And they lose it at the start of the supply chain because of inappropriate agricultural practices, because of drought, because of disease, a whole range of other reasons. So here's the global picture. We're under Oceania, and with our North American cousins, we are about the worst food wasters in the world. And I always get asked the question at the end, why are we the worst food wasters in the world? Well, because food is cheaper here than nearly anywhere else in the world as a percentage of your income. We're the second cheapest country in the world for food, and so we've lost the value of food. We don't care throwing it out, we're too busy. So, as you can see here, most of the food in Australia is wasted at the end of the supply chain by consumers, by retailers, and so on. Very different scenario in sub-Saharan Africa, where most of it is lost at the start of the supply chain. But, on average, 42% of the food produced or imported into this country is wasted in some form or another, 42%. What's more, we waste about 4 times the amount of calories than our near neighbours in countries like Indonesia. And this scenario just can't continue if we are to feed a population of 10 billion people by 2050. Who's heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Only a couple of people? Okay. So the developed world and much of the developing world committed to these 17 Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. One of them specifically relates to food waste. It's Goal 12, which is responsible production and consumption. And under that, 12.3 is a commitment from those who are, have joined this cause to halve food waste by 50% by 2030. So this is a massive global undertaking at the moment. In terms of how we're tracking right now, obviously we're 10 years out or thereabouts from 2030. About half the countries of the world have committed to reduce food waste by that amount, but only a fraction of the population. Because if you look at Asia and India and so on, none of those countries have made that commitment yet. So we've still got a long way to go. So why reduce food waste? There's many reasons, but this is a key one. The social reasons are immense. 800 million people a year are undernourished, and about something like 25 million children a year die of hunger-related diseases. Conversely, there's about 1 billion people around the world which eat too much, and I'm probably one of them, and that is also known as food waste in a way. A key environmental reason is greenhouse gas emissions. So if food loss and waste were a country, it would be the third biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, after countries like China and the US, but amazingly ahead of other countries, very populated countries like India and Russia. And this may surprise you, but food waste rotting in landfill emits nearly 6 times the amount of greenhouse gases than what the global aviation industry does. Now, most people would look to the aviation industry and a plane flying overhead with plumes of exhaust out the back, thinking, geez, that's the culprit, that's why we've got climate change. Well, actually, you throwing out food is also a major contributor. And so it's everyone's responsibility to actually do something about this. And there's key economic reasons why a business or an individual would look at doing something about reducing food waste. In a study of near 1,200 companies, 700 companies in 17 countries published recently, the average return from doing something about food waste, so putting in a food waste reduction initiative in your company, was 14 to 1. So every dollar invested, $14 came back to that company. For countries, and the reason why the Australian government has funded this CRC, is about 250 to 1 return. And so that's an amazing return for any government to receive back on their investment. But it's not just about the basic economic values of dollars and cents, it's also about conserving resources. So about 70% of the fresh water in the world is used to grow food, of which 25% of that water is then wasted. So again, it's a massive proportion of our fresh water that goes to waste for food that we don't eat. Other things like improving reputation, and I'll touch on that a bit more later, complying with laws and upholding ethics are all economic reasons as well. But here's a key driver, is that food waste is now seen as a $1 trillion economic opportunity globally. $1 trillion per annum. And when groups like the Boston Consulting Group start saying this is a major opportunity that we need to embrace, I'm sure you understand the importance of that. Unfortunately, they also predict that the food waste problem is going to get much worse before it gets better. And we're really at the start of the journey. So on to the third part of the talk today, and that's what's happening in food loss and waste in Australia. So this is a sign from a pack house just north of Adelaide. I won't mention the company. And to give you some idea, about 45% of the potatoes that go into that pack house get graded out. So 45% of premium potatoes go to waste out of that industry. Can you imagine 45% of whatever you grow or make or sell going to waste? I mean, it makes it unsustainable business. So if we look at what food we consume versus what we waste out of everything grown in this country, you can see grain is about 38% loss. That's mainly as bread. So it's grain turned into bread and then wasted is one of the major items there. Seafood has very large losses, so about 50% of what's caught, that's what's targeted, and brought into the store actually gets consumed. But fruit and vegetables is the worst, 52% loss. So we throw away over half of what's grown. And meat and milk are much leaner supply chains, but that's good because they're also much more carbon intensive. Of course, food loss and waste occurs right along the supply chain. So whether it's in the paddock, where these apples are being left to rot because the market fell out, or the value of them decline. This is a pack house in the Riverland with mandarins. Again, massive rejection rates, and you can see it's just labelled waste. Sometimes it goes to animal feed, sometimes it goes to compost. Often it goes to landfill. The food manufacturing sector, again, very large amounts of waste. Supermarkets are also culprits there. And of course, us in the home, as I pointed out before, are the worst culprits. So I'm from an ag background, and so if we just look at ag for a sec, something like $1.8 billion worth of fruit and veg grown in this country is thrown away. 1.8 billion. And if you look at this, look at cauliflowers, for example, 37% of what's grown doesn't even leave the farm. Then they go to the supermarket, another 10% is wasted. They might go into manufacturing, 20% wasted. Then they go into your home, and further gets wasted. So probably about 80% of cauliflowers get wasted. I've got to say my daughter's not too worried about that statistic when I tell her because she hates cauliflower, but anyway. And this is something to take note of. Food waste in the household costs the average family, at least in New South Wales, $3,800 per year. That's a decent holiday. Victoria, it seems to be a little bit less. South Australia, we don't have figures yet. But if we actually extrapolate that figure out to the total number of households in Australia, which is about 10 million, that means it's a near $40 billion problem in itself. In terms of our best estimates for what food waste is costing us in this country, a student of mine a couple of years ago crunched the numbers and came up with the figure 18 to 20 billion. And that's the figure that the government now uses in all their national waste strategy and so on. And again, most of that is occurring at the household level. And I say 10 plus billion there because, as I just mentioned in the last slide, it could actually be 40 in itself. Fortunately, after publishing some of these estimates in 2015, we started to win some friends and influence people. And Anthony Pratt has been a real champion in trying to address or doing something about food waste. And who's seen The War on Waste? Quite a few people. It's been one of the most popular shows that ABC has ever put on. It's going into its third season now. And people, that first episode, which was very much around food waste, that's the one people go back and watch on iView and things like that. So in November 2017, the Australian government launched the National Food Waste Strategy, and that committed this country to a 50% food waste reduction by 2030. And that's the framework of which the strategy is built on, and now there's an a committee which I'm part of that is actually developing the plan of how this is going to be rolled out over the next 10 years. Now, what's interesting is this is funded by the Department of Environment because it's all about reducing food waste going to landfill and creating greenhouse gases. So it's actually part of Emission Reduction Fund and so on. So the last part of the talk is just about this CRC. Now, this CRC only started in July 1 last year, but it's been 5 years in the making. And that's what it takes to get a big CRC up like this. The take-home message is, in terms of what this CRC is about, is that we want to create value out of waste. You manage something better if there's value in it. You either put value on it or it does have a value. It can be turned into something valuable. And so we want to push up this internationally accepted food recovery hierarchy and create more and more value out of it. So what's going into composting now should be going into industrial uses and so on. Now, just in terms of some of the stats, we are now, so we're being told, the world's biggest research and development organisation focused on food waste. And that's quite, that's a great thing for that centre to be based here in Adelaide at the Wake campus, to be world leaders in this area, considering we're quite late to the party. In terms of the funding, we have $64 million cash. About half of that's from the federal government, half of it's from our industry partners, and $57 million in kind. 57 participants and around 200 people involved at any one time in the organisation. But they're right around Australia and a number of experts from overseas as well. We've been funded for 10 years and we're expected to create $2 billion worth of economic value. And this will just give you an idea of some of the participants. There's also a flyer on most of the tables if you want to read a little more about the CRC. But a lot of these names you would know, whether it's KPMG or Favco, one of the biggest horticulture companies in Queensland, the Matolo Group, Pete Soils, Pete Waterwitz, who's a legend in this area. Woolworths is one of our big supermarkets. A lot of the big horticulture companies here, Thomas Food and Zarella. All the peak bodies like Food and Grocery Council and so on. The food rescue organisations, Food Bank and OzHarvest. Swiss Vitamins, because they want to create nutrition out of waste, which is really innovative. And we've got the leading universities that are working in this area. So it's quite a big collaboration. Oh, sorry. So just to paint the picture and to finish off with, I'll just go through the programs of the CRC. There's three main pillars. Reduce. So we want to reduce food waste throughout the supply chain where possible, transform any unavoidable waste, and engage with industry and consumers. So this will be a really big community program over the next 10 years. I'm not going to go through each of the pillars individually, but I'm going to touch on a couple of major points. Woolworths now receives more comment and mail about food waste than nearly any other topic. It's a major theme for them. This was actually a graph from a couple of years ago, and it's jumped since then. Interestingly, this reducing product packaging is the other one. And packaging was really demonised in the War on Waste show. There's bans on plastics and everything like that. Don't always believe what you hear on TV. There wasn't a balanced argument put forward on the war on waste. We need packaging, we just got to use it better. And it's got to be recyclable and compostable and so on. But you take away packaging and food waste will go through the roof. So got to keep that right balance. Food rescue is another alarming area for us. So the latest stats are that about 4 million people each year in Australia are food insecure. So that means at some time in that year they don't know where their next meal was coming from, which is disgusting in a country that produces enough food to feed 3 times its population. We can feed 60 million, yet we don't have enough food to feed people that can't afford food. The social return on investment from doing work in this space is simply amazing. So here, if we can create 60 million meals, which is our aim per annum, the social return on investment is 136 million. And what that is from is a kid going to school, being able to have breakfast because all the food's been donated, and actually being able to go into class and study because they've got a full belly and they can concentrate. That's the social return on investment. It's a very detailed slide, but it just gives you a snapshot of the kind of things we do within the CRC. There's many ways that we can transform food waste into something valuable. So we've identified the major streams and we can identify the major outputs, the major products as well. Working out which product is best for any particular waste stream, so whether it's bread or cheese or citrus, is what the CRC is about. Developing decision support tools so people can create the maximum economic value out of any waste stream. And the one that I love is what's happening in the UK at the moment. They've taken day-old bread, which traditionally went to landfill, and they've turned it into beer. So they're brewing up day-old bread. So when that product comes to Australia, you can sit there and you can drink your beer and you can save the world at the same time. And I think that's fantastic. Finally, we can do the best of work, the best of science in this organisation, but unless we can get that out there, industry using it, consumers taking this up, the message up, then we've failed. And so we've got a very strong program with real industry leaders about getting behaviour change, both within industry and the community as well. And no doubt you'll hear a lot about this organisation in the next 10 years. Finally, what we're talking about isn't new. We can go back 75 years ago when this poster was created by the US Department of Home Economics, I think it was called then. I don't think it exists anymore. And this was during World War II, and food was seen as a weapon back then. And there was posters around, we can beat the Hun, we can beat Hitler if we do better with food. And we never want to return to a time like that again. But as we get to a population of 10 billion, food will be short. And unless we actually do something about reducing the 40% of food we waste, we will be in that situation. So I ask all of you, help fight food waste. Thank you. Yeah, no worries.
Steve is very willing to take questions, and there's one down the back from another Stephen.
Thank you very much for a stimulating talk. I wonder if you would comment on the issue of use-by dates, which seem to me to be unduly conservative.
You're exactly right. Best before dates are important and they should be recognised, but your nose is still a better determinant than anything else. Use by is based on models, and it's a worst case scenario model. So generally you can get a lot further shelf life out of a product than its use by date. Best before is a marketing ploy. And it's really just to make sure you get products turning over in your shelf. So you can pretty much disregard any best before date and just use your common sense. But yes, there will be a program specifically around that within the CRC, because most people, when they see a use by or a best before, it doesn't matter. If they see a date, they throw it out. And I normally have a classic little picture up there of someone they brought in salt that was promoted as 200 million years old from the bottom of the sea or whatever, and had a use by date of next year. Yeah. Or a best before date of next year. Makes no sense at all. So.
Peter Bartels, thank you very much.
Tom.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, right up there.
Sorry, can you hear me? Peter Bartels, just a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. Two-part question, if I can. You've talked about, about what a blight this is on our society. I guess the first question is, how many times we've seen to address some of these problems, the best way to do it is to name and shame industries and people. So one, have you considered that? And two, if you were to consider that, how would you be affected by your industry contribution to your business and make sure there was no conflict of interest?
I can tell you industry is much leaner than households. So a lot of the food waste in industry is actually used for other purposes. It's donated to food charities, it's going into composting and things like that. It's the food that we waste in our house, 90% of it still ends up in landfill, and that's a major problem. So we'd actually need to name and shame the household before we name and shame business, to be honest. And they kind of are doing that in some other countries. So South Korea now, you pay for every kilogram of food you throw out, and they have to go through specific recycling options. And it's a way of, well, you're not putting the name out as such, you're paying directly for any food waste, and you very quickly change your behaviour there. In terms of, well, I should take a step back and say that the complete picture around food waste in Australia isn't well known. It's being built up at the moment. Just yesterday I saw the latest baseline report, and the aged care sector is probably one of the worst in Australia. And so that's, do we want to name and shame there, or do we want to say, okay, unfortunately that's a circumstance that we know is going to happen, but we can actually create value out of it. So we want to take all the aged care waste and actually turn it into pig feed, and changing swill feeding laws and things like that. So I get where you're coming from, but sometimes it doesn't help, not that we're trapped by our industry partners, but we do want to create value out of that, and you do that best by having industry on board. So.
Thank you, Steve. I didn't see on the slide, I may have missed it, but what is your relationship with zero waste in South Australia?
So, Zero Waste is now called Green Industries South Australia, and they are a participant. And we've got their equivalent in the major states, so in Victoria and New South Wales and Queensland, all working together for the first time on a program that's around, if we are to run a 10-year behavioural change program, what does that look like? How do we segment that to different areas of society? How do we deal with cultural issues and so on? So yes, they're very much involved in the CRC. So.
I don't know if you saw the BBC I don't know if you saw the BBC website, news website on the 27th of January. A young Russian woman who went to Copenhagen as the country collapsed after communism was appalled by the waste, and she single-handedly has reduced the whole of Denmark's food waste by 25%, just by basically lobbying, starting with the supermarkets and then concentrating on the consumers. It was amazing, amazing 5-minute clip actually.
I'll certainly go look that up. Since you mentioned Denmark though, one thing that is quite interesting is Prince Mary from Tasmania, who is now, Princess Mary from Tassie is now a major food waste ambassador throughout Europe and is from Denmark. So.
Thank you. Last weekend, a group of us went on board a cruise boat for a trip to Port Lincoln. There was an amazing amount of food put out every morning for a smorgasbord breakfast, a smorgasbord lunch, I dare say most of that food can't be taken back and reused. What happens? Is it fed to the fish, or... And imagine the
No, I don't think they're
amount
allowed
of food
to.
on cruise boats around the world. It'd be enormous.
Yeah, they've probably got a compactor on board, but what they could actually be doing is onboard composting. So there's mobile units now that you can put on a ship that you can deal with waste and actually turn it into a valuable product, by the time the cruise is over. And that's what they need to be doing. It's actually no more expensive. It's similar size equipment. So it's just the way you see it. Is it a valuable resource or is it just waste? So.
Thank you, Stephen. It follows on from Stephen Haynes' question and looking at the photograph on the slide of the carrots. And I guess the question is, how much of your effort is fighting bureaucracy at various levels, whether it be in government, trying to eliminate risk, or whether it be buyers trying to tell us what sort of potatoes and carrots we should eat? How much is your effort directed to try and change bureaucracy?
I can tell you when we started this process, not many people around Australia were interested in food waste, 5-6 years ago. And that's changed a lot in the last few years. Lots of stars have aligned for us to get going. And so, no, we've got very much state and federal government on side. I work with them closely and they're asking all the time, what should we be doing to change this? So I'm not really fighting bureaucracy on that front. One project I mentioned before is swill feeding laws, which means you cannot feed food waste to pigs, even though a lot of people do. And that's the potential of a disease risk. So that will be something that we will come up against some pretty solid red tape on. And understandably, we don't want foot and mouth in this country, but there's ways of treating it to render it safe. And so that will be our next bureaucracy challenge. In terms of, you mentioned specs, and we do have our wonky carrots as behind our logo. Who buys the Odd Bunch program here from Woolworths or its equivalent in some of the other supermarkets? It's not many. And Woolworths would love people to be buying those out-of-spec vegetables more, but people don't. Everyone says that they want them and they want fruit and veg at half the price or even quarter the price sometimes, but when they go into store, they don't actually buy them. So that range was 20-something products originally. It's down to a core staple of 6 or so that actually sell. And so people don't want to buy out-of-spec fruit and veg. If they put it on the shelf, it'll rot. It will go to waste. And so what they're doing by having specs is making sure that we can do something valuable with it rather than waiting till it's all desiccated and then we've got to throw it out. So specs are important, even though that may sound really strange. They're there for a reason. It's what you do with it either side that's important. So.
Thank you. Just one question. As a Rotary Club, we like to give back to the community and contribute however we can. Do you have any suggestions for our club, apart from the individuals obviously doing their bit, that we could work with associations like yours to actually make an impact on the community? Yeah,
certainly. Becoming part of our extension network would be really important. So if anyone's actually interested in this topic, you can join our communication channels. And when there's something that you will think resonate with a Rotary audience, with other clubs, then pass it on to them. And it's just about information exchange and getting the message out. And that's the easiest way. No money changes hands, but it just means that we've got further reach. Now, with the participants we actually have on board, I think we've got an immediate reach of somewhere in the order of about 5 to 10 million through organisations like Woolworths and things like that, and all the food manufacturers. But that doesn't mean we've got the reach in the community, and that's where Rotary could really help.
One more.
You mentioned Peter Wadowitz. I was involved in patenting his biobin.
Fantastic.
Would you like to comment on his involvement in the industry?
Look, I see Peter as an absolute legend, particularly he got up at the recent Food Industry Awards and said this CRC is the best thing since sliced bread. We have that kind of love relationship, but he's been creating value out of food waste for 40 years. He saw the opportunity back then when no one was interested. And whether it's through biobin, whether it's through his composting services, now he's using grease trap oil from fish and chip shops and so on to run his trucks on biodiesel. He's creating bioenergy. So, you know, that's a very innovative business, and he's been doing that for a long time. So,
Steve, that was one of the most down-to-earth talks we've had for a long time, and in recognition of that, I'd like to present you with a very special pen to remind you of this occasion. And thank you very much. Thank you.